All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Dear Editor. This is an educational series from the Research Medical Library where we discuss topics on scientific writing and publishing. And after today's session, we're going to share the slides, and we've put together a handout with some more resources about the topic as well. We're also recording today's session, and we're going to send out a link to the recording after the session as well, so you'll have that. You can also join the Dear Editor team, which we have a link to here, and there will be a link as well in the email afterwards. And you can access today's slides and also previous slides, handouts, and recordings. And if you have any questions and want to continue the conversation, that's a great place to do it as well. So I'm Erica Goodoff. I'm a senior scientific editor in the Research Medical Library. And joining me this morning, this afternoon, I guess, is Joe Munch, who's also an editor in the library. And we're going to be talking about how to craft a manuscript that won't annoy reviewers. And to sort of set up the scope, what we mean by that, we're talking about things that a reviewer would come across that would just sort of slow down their ability to understand your paper. So there are some things that would get your paper rejected outright or not even sent out for review. For example, if it's completely off topic from the journal, if it vastly exceeds the stated word limit for the journal, or maybe doesn't adhere to author guidelines in some other way. If you have a lot of recycled text or they detect plagiarized text in your paper, these are things that might get your paper kicked back immediately without even getting sent to review. I want to point that out because these are not things we're planning to cover here. This is what happens after your paper's gone to review and the reviewer's looking at it. And these are things that are kind of fairly easy to fix before you even submit your paper. So we wanted to share some of those tips with you this morning. So to start off this conversation or this topic, let's go with this. What are some things that irritate you as a reader of scientific papers? Even if you've never reviewed a paper, you've probably read a scientific article. What do you see in there that just makes you go, oh my gosh, I can't make heads or tails out of this, or why didn't they fix that? You can type your answers into the chat if you have a response to this. Non-structured abstracts. Yeah. Really, really long paragraphs. Okay. Errors and so forth. Yeah.
Saw lots of acronyms in there.
Yep.
Alphabet soup. Yeah.
Alphabet soup for sure. No conclusion. Repetitive. Really, really long. Grammatical errors. Kind of text. No conclusion at the end. Self citations. Yeah, and word level things. Okay. So these are a lot of there's a lot of responses here. So you all have opinions about this. Well, what I'll put out to you is things that irritate you as a reader are likely to irritate a reviewer as well. So that's a great place to start when thinking about this topic. What can I do to help make my reviewers, life a little bit easier? Probably the first answer is the same things that would irritate you when reading a paper. So that's a helpful place to start. All right, go on here. And now let's get into some specific things that we can talk about, and I'll turn it over to Joe for this part.
Right. So among the things that are going to annoy reviewers are having to hunt for certain types of information and, finding certain information in places where they don't expect it. So, if they're looking for the rationale of the introduction or the rationale of the study and they don't find it in the introduction, or they're looking for the main conclusions drawn from the study's findings and they're not finding it in the discussion. Some of those things that were mentioned in the chat. And then finding that information that's out of place. So that's like finding methods in the results or finding, new findings in the discussion section, just kind of these, where did this come from kind of information. And that's because scientific articles are, they're highly formulaic. They virtually all follow the same model, either the IMRAD model, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion, or the ERDAM model, where the results are given after the introduction, the methods are preserved for the end. And so experienced reviewers and in general readers of scientific articles expect to find certain information in certain places. And that's not just to say that they expect to find the methods, results, introduction sections in that order or whatever. It also means that they expect to find certain pieces of information at certain places within those sections themselves. So, for example, finding finding the statistical analysis information always at the end of the method section. Next slide, please. Okay, so the tip here is to organize accordingly. When you're putting together your paper, you need to make sure that you use the ERDAM or IMRAD format, depending on the journal you're targeting. And you need to make sure that each part of that manuscript does the job it's supposed to. So the introduction should give the rationale, the method should say what you did, the result should say what you found, and the discussion, rather than simply restating the results, should say what those results mean in the broader context of published literature and implications and so forth. And each of these sections needs to have a predictable structure and content. So because these sections are so specific, there isn't really a whole lot of reason to overlap them. So if you include the right kinds of information in the correct sections, your reviewers are going to find it much more easy to read your paper and appreciate your science and conclusions. Next slide, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. Somebody in the text or in the chat mentioned that papers that are a little bit too repetitive can irritate them a little bit. Restating all of your results again when you get to the discussion is one of the ways that I see that show up sometimes. So I can certainly relate to that one. Anyway, to go on, another thing that helps not irritate your reviewers is to be consistent. And when I'm talking about consistency, here I'm talking about sort of micro level issues. So Joe was talking about organizing your paper in a way that makes sense and is logical. This is sort of a little thing, or what would seem like a little thing, but if there's a lot of little things, it can really, really add up and kind of annoy a reviewer. So for example, if your numbers are inconsistent between the text and the figures, like say you have one of those patient flow charts where you recruited so many patients and then you had to exclude these patients for whatever reason and this other group for another reason, and you tend to have a bunch of numbers. You might state them that way in the text, but then you'll have one of those figures with the flow chart. If the numbers between the two don't match, the reviewer is going to be very confused and going, okay, which is it? Sort of similar to that, if your citations are all over the place, inconsistent or missing. I mentioned repeating results in the discussion section. Another one is if you have results or methods that you describe in the methods section, but then you get to the results and there's no result provided for that experiment or that thing that you described that you did, the reviewer is going to be confused. Another one that's kind of a larger issue is your hypothesis or your purpose statement sort of evolves throughout the course of the paper. The reviewer gets to the method or to the discussion section and is thinking, wait a minute, I thought they were looking at this other thing, and flips back to the introduction section. You don't want your reviewers doing this kind of extra work. These are things that can confuse a reviewer or make them again have to do more work than they need to understand what you're trying to do. So one of the things you can do to ensure consistency, certainly as you write, there's a lot of revision going on. There's a lot of changes happening. One thing that might help you with some of this is to keep a master version and track changes as they're made. So if you're sending out, if you have, say 10 co-authors and they've all made changes to the paper, it can help you to keep track of who changed what. One of the things that can happen when you have multiple writers of one paper is you get inconsistent terms, where you have the same word that's referring to this, where you have like, 2 or 3 different words referring to the same thing throughout the paper. And that can be a really distracting thing to a reviewer, certainly. So the best thing you can do there, again, keep track of changes and keep a master version so you're making your changes as you go along and you can sort of prevent that sort of drift of terminology. And certainly, what it really comes down to is take a final look at this before you submit the paper. Cross-check your values in the abstract with the text. Check your figure and table numbering, especially if you've added or taken out a table or a figure, or you've combined them, or you've changed some of them to supplemental tables or something like that. You want to make sure that's all, correct when you actually submit the paper. There's nothing wrong with making those revisions. Obviously, we encourage it, but you want to go back at the end and make sure that that's what you want it to look like. And of course, we're always going to say have a colleague do a final check. That can be a colleague, can be one of your co-authors. You can also send it to us. This is definitely, these are definitely things that we look for all the time as we're editing these papers. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Joe. Did you have anything to add to that when talking about the details?
No, it's just that, when we see reviewer comments and we see them often because, authors have to respond to those. We often see those little things like, you mentioned 26 patients in the text, but when I would turn to the table, there was 30. What happened? And that, it gives the impression that you're not really paying attention to what you're doing, and that's not a good thing for a reviewer to see. So along those lines, in addition to being consistent, one thing that you must ensure that you do is to have a well-written paper, because there's nothing that will do more to distract from reviewers, to distract them from understanding your science and appreciating your conclusions and so forth, is bad writing. And that includes things like spelling errors, poor grammar, and incorrect punctuation. These little things that as you're reading, you just kind of you as a reader yourself just kind of you trip over them, and it impedes your reading of the thing and your understanding. But this also means slapdash organization and overwrought or tortuous paragraphs that you can't really follow the thread of logic through, or convoluted phrasing where things are just written unclearly. And you must do everything you can, rather, to ensure that your paper is just as polished as it can be. And that means using a few of these tricks. And some occur during the writing process, and some can occur towards the end, right when you're about to submit. But use those subsection headings in the methods and results, because they help organize your thoughts in your writing. When you're writing about any topic, limit that topic to one paragraph. Begin those paragraphs with a topic sentence, and within those paragraphs, use transition phrases. And in terms of writing, transition sentences and transitions in general are usually the thing that I find most papers lacking, especially in the discussion section, especially in the introduction section, where it's almost as if the author expects the reader and reviewer to make this enormous leap of logic, and you don't want them making that leap by themselves. You want to give them the vine to swing on, so to speak. You want to make sure that they're making the connection you want them to make. And so as you're writing, you should be revising, and that means getting feedback from co-authors, obviously, but it also means getting feedback from other people. It means getting feedback from editors, such as myself and Erica. It means getting feedback from even a spouse or a friend or a colleague not within your writing group, just to ensure that you're being understood as a writer. And as you're doing these revisions and you're approaching the submission phase of this, you should do these kind of spot checks to, does a sentence take up more than 4 lines of text? Maybe it's time to break that down into 2 or 3 sentences. Always do your spelling, grammar, and punctuation checks. And as you're doing those spelling checks, just make sure that you're not, don't rely too heavily on spelling check to grab everything, because of course there's certain words that are homonyms that, there, and there. Any of those can be misused, but spell check won't pick them up. So some of that can be done with the spell checker. Some of it must be done by yourself or an editor.
Yeah. One of the other tips that helps with that is reading the text aloud to yourself as you're revising. Sometimes if you trip over it when you're reading it out loud, it's like, oh, maybe I should rewrite that. And actually, Word will do that for you now if you have editor. Don't want to get too far off topic.
Right.
But
real editors are best.
it's true. It's true.
live
No, the
editors, I
robot
should
will
say.
read it just as you have it. So if it's wrong, it'll read it wrong. But anyway.
So building on, this idea of polishing your writing, the things I just talked about are highly they're mostly on the technical side, right? They're mostly about how you build the paragraphs and how you structure your sentences and so forth. But there's this narrative that you have to give to your readers and reviewers, and if you don't give them this story in a way that's expected, reviewers will not be able to follow what you're trying to get at. And so some of the other things that annoy reviewers could be that the study rationale is unclear, or that the gap in knowledge that you're trying to fill remains unstated, or you haven't stated the purpose of the study, or you haven't given the purpose for performing certain experiments or an explanation of the overall aim of those experiments. You might give findings for unnamed methods. So if you're describing a method in the methods section, you don't have to redescribe it in the results section, but there should be a mention of that method to say, what findings the method yielded, instead of just kind of throwing those findings out there and expecting reviewers again to make a connection. Some other things are findings that are just kind of left out there on a limb. Here are my findings, and there's no real interpretation of them. Okay, so you found these things, but what does that mean? And finally, if you're leaving those conclusions unstated, reviewers want to know, what you're taking away from the study and what they should take away from the study. So highly important to kind of give all these milestones in your paper so that reviewers can follow you from point A to point B and kind of understand where you're coming from, what you've done, and where you're going. So we mentioned earlier that reviewers expect to find certain types of information in certain places. And that doesn't mean that when they find this information, they'll be able to immediately make those connections that you want them to make. So just to reemphasize, your writing must guide reviewers through the story of your science. You need to tell them why your study is important, why certain experiments were performed, what certain findings mean, and you don't want to make your reviewers do the extra work of figuring this all out. And so this is why we have this story of the science checklist. And that's because in editing so many scientific manuscripts, we're seeing these trouble spots where in the introduction, there hasn't been a real substantiation of a gap in knowledge. In other words, the background information given isn't pertinent to the gap in knowledge, or the way that it's given is convoluted, so you don't understand what the gap in knowledge is coming from. In the methods, there's no explanation of why certain experiments were done. And of course, there's some experiments that were done, the explanation is fairly straightforward, but for something like Western blot. But if there's a particular set of experiments that you performed to achieve a certain goal, you should state that goal. Of course, in the results, there could be no indication of how certain findings were obtained, again, not restating the method, or no explanation of what certain findings mean. And that doesn't mean a detailed explanation such as you would give in the discussion, but just kind of a pinning this, saying these findings indicate X, and that would be revisited in the discussion. And in the discussion section, we often see that conclusions are not given, or the findings were simply restated without any context from previous studies. So just a quick list of things to keep in mind as you're prepping that paper for the target journal.
Yeah, helpful checklist there. Yeah, so there's a lot of little kind of details and that sort of thing to think about. For these last couple of tips, I think it's also worth pointing out that the tone that you use in your paper matters a lot. When you are talking about other people's work, and there's a couple of places in your paper where you need to do that. In the introduction section, you might talk about previous work that led you to come up with the research that you're doing. When you get to the discussion, you might be talking about other findings that are similar to yours or maybe not similar to yours. But anytime you're talking about someone else's work and not just putting in a citation, but so and so found that this was the case, or found similar findings to ours. Keep in mind that whoever you're talking about, there's always a chance that that person could be one of your reviewers. Or just generally think about, if talking about someone else's work, talk about it the same way you would talk about your own work. You don't want to use a tone that's going to sound like, well, their work was awful or something like that, because again, that could end up being your reviewer. And I think if I was reviewing a work and someone said, oh, my work was terrible, I'd be like, oh, well, I'm not going to accept this paper. So, I mean, that's an obvious thing. There's also just kind of a general professionalism aspect to it. Using a diplomatic tone just helps prevent, again, problems like this. And also, it shows that, you know what you're talking about and doesn't distract from what your work is really about. So some examples here. Again, describing your work like you would describe your others' work like you would describe your own work is a good sort of rule of thumb. You don't want to ever say, so and so failed to get robust results. Again, think about what you would feel like if somebody said that about your work. Ooh, that's probably not a good way to word that. Yeah, similarly, the second example here, there's a little bit more detail, but again, I think it could be finessed a little bit. The study was underpowered and had a really heterogeneous patient population. That may be true, but I don't think I would word it that way. Presumably here the author would be wanting to say why someone else's findings might be different from theirs. One of the ways that you can easily avoid this is just, focus on the strengths of your study rather than maybe limitations of a previous study. Ours was the largest population to date, something to that effect. And also, you want to make sure that you're not misrepresenting previous work. If you're trying to spin it, that may be your aim, but where the reviewer might see is instead of you spinning it and saying, oh, well, they're focusing on, the negative or the positive here. Maybe they just didn't understand what that work was about. And that's the last thing you want a reviewer to think, is that you don't know what's going on. So it's good to, be diplomatic, and straightforward, and also, make sure that you're talking about others' work in the same way that you would talk about your own work. That would certainly annoy a reviewer. Last thing, kind of related to that, is this is when, after your work has been reviewed, let's say you got feedback back from the journal and they want you to revise it and resubmit it, or maybe they just rejected it, but you did get reviewer criticisms or comments about your paper. When you respond to them, make sure that you address all those valid criticisms that reviewers have. Even if you don't agree with them, you want to make sure to acknowledge them. Certainly, if you're going to revise and resubmit to a journal, that can be good news. It means that they're interested in your topic. But if you don't address all of the reviewer comments, first of all, it's likely going to go back to the same reviewers and they're going to know that you just ignored it. That would irritate a reviewer to see, oh, well, they didn't even do anything with it. Now, that doesn't mean that every reviewer comment is helpful. Some of them just are, are not quite right for your paper or whatever. But you do want to make sure that you address all of them. You can at least acknowledge it. You could say, thanks for pointing that out. Here's why it doesn't apply, or so forth and so on. But generally speaking, a lot of reviewer comments are just going to make your paper better. I mean, so that's the main reason to make sure that you respond to them. And even if you don't end up submitting it back to the same journal and you send it to a different journal, if you haven't addressed any of those comments, there's a chance those reviewers might end up being the reviewers at the other journal, and that would get a little bit awkward. So just kind of some general ways that you might do that. In the handout that we're going to send out after, I have sort of a really basic template if you aren't sure where to start. There's really not a way that you have to do it. You don't have to follow that template. There's actually a number of them on the internet that I've seen. But the important thing is you want to make sure that it's clear that you've addressed the reviewer comments. Hey, thanks for pointing this out. We revised as suggested, on page such and such, or line such and such, or maybe we've highlighted the changes, as long as it's clear what you did and someone can follow it. Or, hey, we weren't able to do this because, and saying, well, okay, thanks for the comment. It doesn't apply here and here's why. Again, just addressing it. And you always want to thank them. Be very polite with your responses. Even if the reviewer wasn't polite, I'm very sorry if that has happened to you. Unfortunately, sometimes they're not. That doesn't mean you have to be rude back. They have their own thing. It isn't your fault. Your focus is on your paper and getting good science out there. So that's what you can focus on when you're responding to reviewers. Even if their tone isn't what you would prefer, you can still do better. Okay, so I will wrap it up there. We're almost at the end of the hour. Does anyone have any questions or other things they want to ask about today's topic? While you're thinking about that, I will also say that here again is a link, and I'll repeat that we are going to send out copies of the slides. Again, we have a handout with a number of resources for you that I think will be helpful in helping you avoid some of these problems that would annoy a reviewer as you're preparing your paper. There's links to things on our website, things elsewhere on the internet as well. And as I said, I put together a really basic template if you're not sure how to start with a reviewer, with a rebuttal letter. So that's going to be available to you. And again, we did record this morning's session, so I'll send you out a link to that as well. Also wanted to say there are some additional upcoming events that Research Medical Library is going to have in the next couple of months. EndNote tutorials specifically, again, helping you keep your citations in order. There's a couple of those starting in a couple of weeks. There's an advanced one if you've never used EndNote before. There's a beginner one in early November. And let's see, just generally, if you're looking for tools to help you out, Tool Time Tuesday is a great resource. It's every other Tuesday. The next one is on October 3rd. And later on in October, we are going to be talking about AI tools in writing, and Joe, I believe, is going to be presenting that one. So just some upcoming events for you. I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So, all right. Did you have anything else to add, Joe?
On your last points about responding to reviewers, the most difficult part of that is responding to a reviewer comment that could be just way off base or inappropriate for the paper. And just be ready to make a coherent argument for why you're not addressing that. And again, be diplomatic and polite, but have some reference citations ready and all that good stuff. So yeah, that maintain that polite professionalism at all costs, and you'll see them, reviewers can make some snide remarks. Be the better person.
Yes, for sure. And I want to point out also, if you have a revised paper, and we as editors will check your rebuttal letter as well. Certainly, that's something I see a lot. I do not edit anything that a reviewer says, but I can help your responses be clearer and that sort of thing. The reviewer tone is what it is. That isn't my problem. That isn't your problem. You just want good science.
Right. Yeah, we will even help you tone down your language.
Yeah.
So if you have a very visceral response to what the reviewers are saying, write it down. Just don't send it to the reviewers. You can send it our way and probably be therapeutic.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not offended, but yeah, don't share that. All right. Yeah, and as always, thanks everybody for coming this morning or this afternoon. I keep forgetting what time of day it is. Thanks for coming. Again, we'll send follow-up information, and feel free to contact us with questions. And always, Editing Services is here if you have a paper that you're not sure what to do with, if you want to clean it up for reviewers, or just you're at a much earlier stage and want some review, happy to help with that. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Take care.